The End of Joe Fires. Part 1. I have lost the taste for coffee was the first thought that crossed Joe Fire's mind when he woke up after his 12-hour electro dream shift. The thought startled him as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Coffee had been his daily companion, a ritual that grounded him. And now, after 12 hours of unconscious brain-renting work, he felt nothing. It was unsettling, like a piece of his identity had slipped away. The electro dream shift was the new frontier of productivity. While you slept, your brain could be rented out to process data, solve complex problems, or create simulations for corporations. It promised a dual benefit, rest and income, while you slept. No one had warned him about the lingering side effects, though. Or maybe they had, but no one really paid attention to the fine print when it came to progress. Lara, his wife, was already up, her long hair still slightly damp from a shower. She stood at the kitchen counter, preparing a simple breakfast: eggs, toast, and freshly warmed bread. She greeted him with a gentle smile and a warm good morning. But as Joe sat at the table staring at the food, he realized something else was missing. He wasn't hungry. "I warmed this up for you," she said, sliding the plate toward him. Joe blinked, barely registering the movement. He wasn't interested. He glanced at her, his mind wandering away from the warmth of her gesture. Her voice started to fill the room, talking about the plans for the day, some errands, maybe a visit to the museum later, but it sounded distant, hollow. "Sure," Joe muttered absently, offering a few syllables in return. His thoughts drifted back to coffee. For decades, it had been a small pleasure, an anchor to his routine. The rich aroma, the warmth that spread through his body with each sip, the way it brought clarity to his thoughts, and now the thought of it stirred nothing in him. They left their apartment together, walking side by side but disconnected, like two planets orbiting the same star but existing in their own separate worlds. The city around them hummed with energy, sleek metal and glass reflecting the sun's rays as they boarded the hypersonic train. The destination was the mountains, a place they had visited countless times before. Joe had always found peace there, in the cool air and rugged terrain. It was as if the mountains were the only place where he could escape the hyper-paced city life. He stared out the window of the train as they zoomed across the landscape, the cityscape blurring into the distance. His eyes drifted to Lara. Once she had seemed ethereal to him, her sharp, glacial features like some sculpture carved by the gods themselves. She had been stunning, and in her 30s, she still held that beauty, though time had softened some edges. He used to feel a surge of pride, of love, when he looked at her. Now he only felt familiarity. He had grown used to everything. It was as though life had become a series of static images. The joy, the novelty, the beauty, they were all still there, but muted, like old photographs slowly fading with time. He glanced back out the window. The mountains loomed in the distance, their snow-capped peaks shimmering in the morning sun. Lately, all he could think about was the sun. It was a craving, like a need for air. His dreams were filled with it, blazing, endless expanses of warmth and light. No matter what his brain was rented out to do during the electro-dream shifts, his subconscious always returned to the same place. The sun, high in the sky, away everything below. He couldn't explain it, but the sun was the only thing that seemed real anymore. The train glided smoothly into the mountain station. Joe and Lara stepped out into the crisp air, surrounded by towering cliffs and jagged ridges. The sun was high now, casting long shadows across the valley. Lara chatted on, her words lost in the roar of wind and silence between them. Joe breathed deeply, feeling the sunlight on his skin. For a moment, it was like everything else fell away. The electro dreams, the lack of hunger, the fading pleasures, all that mattered was the sun, and in its warmth, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a vague sense of connection. But as the moment passed, the emptiness returned, and he was left wondering what exactly had been taken from him. The sun burned bright above, but somewhere deep inside, Joe Fires felt like he was beginning to drift further into the dark. Part 2. The resort nestled in the Rocky Mountains was overcrowded, as it always was. Not many places on Earth still allowed you to see the sun. Only at certain altitudes did the smog and cloud layers dissipate enough to catch a glimpse of that blazing light. Joe Fires took in the panoramic view, the snow-dusted peaks rising like sentinels around the valley, the fresh mountain air filling his lungs, and the sun's warmth seeping into his skin. It should have been invigorating. And for the first time in months, it almost was. The combination of sunlight, fresh air, and towering beauty did stir something in him, even if faintly. Perhaps this might slow down the rock transmutation, the syndrome he had been diagnosed with, a cruel affliction of the modern world. It was a condition where people gradually lost interest in the pleasures of life, and along with that, any emotional connection to the ones they loved. It was called rock transmutation because the final stage left you emotionally frozen, like a boulder with no will or capacity to feel anything at all. Lara stood beside him, her long coat flapping gently in the mountain breeze, but she seemed distant. She had always been the strong one, a nurse before she had given it all up to take care of Joe when his mind began to crack. Today, her eyes were worried, though her voice remained steady, keeping the conversation light as they walked through the bustling resort. Joe could tell she was trying to hide the growing tension, but he could feel it radiating from her. She had noticed the little things, how he didn't react to her words, how he barely ate, how he seemed lost in the sun's distant glow. They sat at a table in the resort's open-air restaurant overlooking the valley. Lara decided to order non-synthetic food today, despite how unappetizing it looked. She was trying, in her own quiet way, to pull him back, to remind him of things they used to enjoy. But Joe simply stared at the plate, his stomach empty but his appetite non-existent. He hadn't eaten since the day before, and even then, it had been just a few bites. But strangely, he felt no hunger. He wasn't worried. The sun was at its highest point now, bathing everything in brilliant light, and for the first time in days, maybe even weeks, Joe felt something stir deep within him. Not an emotion, but a kind of awakening. It wasn't pleasant, but it was something. His bones seemed to hum under the sun's rays as if they were finally remembering what it meant to feel alive. He didn't want it to stop. Then came the screams. At first, they were distant, just faint, alarming sounds that echoed up from the resort's lower levels. Joe blinked, not fully registering them until the commotion spread. More people began to scream, their voices rising in pitch and terror. People all around the resort turned, eyes wide with panic as the once relaxed atmosphere shattered. A flood of terrified vacationers scrambled for the exits, pushing and shoving in their desperate rush to escape. A few were knocked over, trampled in the chaos. In the distance, Joe could see the cause of the panic. A group of men, armed with bats and machetes, swarmed toward the resort like a dark tide, cutting down anyone in their path. They were shouting, their voices sharp with rage, as they carved a path of blood through the peaceful mountain refuge. Lara grabbed Joe's arm, her face pale, her voice taut with fear. "Joe, we have to go!" But Joe didn't move. The sun was still high, warm, brilliant against his skin. He felt something. For the first time in so long, he felt a stirring deep within. It wasn't fear. It was something far more primal, more electric. He felt alive in a way he hadn't for months, and he didn't want to leave. "Joe!" Lara shouted, pulling at him, but she had to let go as a surge of panicked people pushed her away. In a blink, she was swept up in the stampede, disappearing into the crowd. Joe remained, standing in the blinding sunlight, watching as some of the resort's guests ran while others, like him, stayed. A few had the same look in their eyes that Joe felt in his bones. A hunger, a thrill, something long buried that was now starting to rise. He looked around for something to fight with, his gaze falling on the heavy wooden chairs that lined the balcony. He grabbed one, tearing it apart to fashion a crude but sturdy weapon. All around him, people were screaming, not just in fear, but in something else. There was a strange energy in the air, a scream of adrenaline, of desperation, of lust for life in the face of death. It mirrored the scream Joe felt inside himself, a deep, hollow roar that had been building for so long, and finally, it was ready to break free. The horde of attackers drew closer, their brutal faces and bloodied weapons visible now as they advanced through the resort's gates. Some guests had already fallen under their assault, but others had stopped running, just like Joe. Some were armed with broken furniture, others with kitchen knives grabbed from the resort's restaurants. A small ragtag group of people began to form, each one with the same grim look of defiance, each one ready to fight back. The scream inside Joe erupted, filling his chest and throat as he charged toward the attackers. His heart pounded, his skin tingled under the relentless sun, and for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something overwhelming. Something unstoppable. It was a scream of fear, yes, but also of anger, thrill, and something dark, something he hadn't known was still inside him. He swung his makeshift weapon and joined the fray. Part 3. In the sterile, brightly lit laboratory, the hum of machines and the soft chatter of scientists filled the air. Screens flickered with data streams, each representing a sliver of the consciousness of the man known only as Inmate 7622. A handful of scientists gathered around a large central display, while nearby a few military personnel stood at attention. The head researcher, Dr. Wallace, and General Lin were engaged in a quiet but intense discussion with a representative from the Ministry of National Security. The screens showed a cascade of neurological patterns, vivid simulations of landscapes, people, and emotions, all the byproducts of the inmate's mind during his constant artificial dreams. The lab had turned into a marvel of the new age, combining neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and behavioral modification. And now, the product of their experiment was becoming something of a triumph. Inmate 7622 is showing extraordinary adaptability, Dr. Wallace remarked, pointing to the data with obvious pride. His responses are rich and complex, providing invaluable training data for our AI models. He's living through hundreds of simulated scenarios every week. His emotions, decisions, and instincts are all being captured in real time. General Lin nodded, his sharp gaze never leaving the screen. And no complications, no signs of psychological breakdown? None, Dr. Wallace replied confidently. In fact, quite the opposite. He's thriving in a way we hadn't predicted. By allowing these simulations to play out, he's able to express his most primal instincts without any societal consequences. No physical harm, no riots, no cost to society. The psychological pressure on him is actually less than in a traditional prison setting. The ministry representative, a tall woman in a crisp suit, smiled slightly. It's quite an elegant solution, she mused, her eyes scanning the data. Dangerous criminals made useful, contributing to society without even leaving their cells. No chance of escape, no violence, minimal upkeep. And the inmates, despite being incarcerated, are being given a chance to experience life in a way, correct? Dr. Wallace nodded. Exactly. Their minds are fully engaged 24 hours a day, linked to the neural simulation systems. We don't just suppress their violent nature. We allow them to live it out in controlled environments. It's a humane way of managing them, and at the same time, they provide us with valuable data for training our AI. The cost savings are significant, and there's no longer a need for large prison complexes. Just the minimal resources to keep them alive. The ministry representative leaned back, clearly impressed. Inmate 7622 seems to be a particular success, from what I've been briefed on. High-functioning, intelligent, able to maintain multiple complex dream lives. What's next for him? General Lin exchanged a glance with Dr. Wallace. We continue as we are for now, Lin said. We'll refine the process, expand the program once the results are fully analyzed. Inmate 722 is an ideal case study, but we need to make sure it works across a wider population before we roll this out publicly. Speaking of public, the ministry representative interjected, we'll need to announce this at some point. The public will be curious, and so will the media. Inmate 7622, it's too impersonal. When the story gets out, people are going to want a face, a name, something that humanizes this program. Dr. Wallace smiled softly, as if he had been expecting this. Actually, we already have a name, he said, gesturing to the screen. In the dream simulations, inmates aren't just numbers. They create identities for themselves, characters that they live through. Inmate 7622, over the course of many sessions, has chosen a name for himself. And what's that? The representative asked, intrigued. Joe Fires. The name hung in the air for a moment, as if it carried some hidden meaning, some deeper significance. Dr. Wallace continued, his voice taking on a more philosophical tone. It's a name that he gave himself during one of the earlier dream sequences, back when we were still experimenting with the level of immersion. In the simulations, he's been living a life of struggle, of survival, of self-discovery. He crafted this identity on his own, a man hardened by experience, still searching for something, even if he doesn't fully understand what. The ministry representative raised an eyebrow. "Joe fires. It's memorable." Dr. Wallace nodded. "Memorable and meaningful. We believe it represents the duality of his existence in the simulations. On the one hand, a figure consumed by the trials he faces in these dream worlds. On the other, someone who is always drawn to the warmth of the sun, the idea of life and vitality, even as everything else crumbles. It's fitting." The ministry representative smiled, satisfied. "It's perfect. We'll use it for the program launch. It makes the story feel personal, relatable. Joe fires an inmate finding purpose, even behind bars, contributing to society while living a new life in his dreams. The public will love it." As the meeting wound down, Dr. Wallace watched the data feed of inmate 7622, Joe Fires, carefully. He had lived hundreds of lives in the simulations, a coffee drinker turned warrior, a man watching the love of his life slip away, a fighter facing down a horde under a brilliant sun. He experienced loss, rage, and even fleeting moments of triumph, all while his body remained in the sterile confines of his cell. But for the lab, it didn't matter. What mattered was the data he provided, the patterns he created for the artificial intelligence systems to learn from. Joe Fires was a success, not as a man, but as a tool, a mind put to work even in his deepest dreams. As Dr. Wallace turned away, satisfied, the image on the screen flickered for a brief moment. Joe Fires stood under the sun, surrounded by chaos, feeling something deep within him awaken, a sense of connection, of primal need. And for that brief instant, there was a flash of awareness, as if somewhere, deep inside, he knew. He knew he wasn't free, but that scream never escaped, buried deep within the endless loop of dreams, lost forever in a reality that was no longer his own.